Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Doug Sailors. I'm a partner in ISG's cybersecurity practice. ISG is a global leading technology and advisory firm, and I'm joined today by Ben from Loeb. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, Ben Kback. I'm a partner at Loeb in the technology and sourcing groups. We do a lot of procurement deals, major outsourcings, the works.
Thanks, Ben. I think today we want to focus on really what's happening in contracting for cybersecurity services. Ben, would you mind giving us sort of your view on what's happening in the market from a traditional managed services provider versus MSSP contracts?
Absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of activity these days in the cybersecurity space. Large companies are outsourcing the operation of their cybersecurity practices, and this is creating an interesting hiccup in the managed services model, particularly around liability. We're used to seeing liability structured as everybody knows it is. There's a cap on liability. If the provider fails to perform its services, their liability is going to be capped at a certain amount, usually keyed to the value of the contract. There are higher caps for a specific breach of their data security obligations and related liability. In managed security services, if the vendor breaches their services obligations, they can cause a data security breach. It's not necessarily the same as a data security breach in the traditional sense. Their systems may not have been exposed. The data that they're processing on behalf of their customers may not have been exposed. But now their customers' systems are exposed because they failed to do something. And suddenly you're in this weird world where liability under the traditional managed services model would be capped at a much lower level because it's not a breach, again, not a breach of the data security obligations under the agreement, but the customer would be out a lot of money and facing extreme potential risk.
Yeah, that's a pretty big risk. And I think most of our customers probably don't understand that right out of the gate. One of the things that we have seen from a market perspective is a rise of what I would call standalone cybersecurity outsourcing contracts. There's a couple of drivers for that. One of them is the CISO organizations are becoming more of a compliance organization and doing less, operational work around vulnerability management, as an example. But the other driver for that seems to be related to liability. And our clients in that space, I think, tend to believe that any breach of any service would automatically default them into the super cap.
Yep.
Are you seeing that same kind of behavior?
We're definitely seeing the same kind of behavior on the customer side, where the customer now expects its service providers to take on enhanced liability for what would have traditionally just been a breach of their services obligations. And the thinking is that if the vendor breaches their services obligations and that breach causes an exposure and a weakening of the customer's cybersecurity practices, the customer needs to be able to recover. So now everything, or almost everything, is subject to a super cap.
Interesting. Another thing that we've seen in the last, year is some major providers asking for abandonment clauses in standalone cybersecurity deals. Have you run into that? And even if not, sort of what's your opinion on that one?
We haven't totally seen that yet, though we know it's coming. It seems that the vendors are looking for an out to avoid enhanced liability for simply walking away if they find this not to be a particularly fruitful or profitable venture. But this again sort of hints at the underlying flaws in the managed services model for a cybersecurity deal, because you don't want your cybersecurity vendor to walk away without enhanced liability.
Absolutely. So from a liability perspective, what we typically see in a normal managed services deal is 12 to 15 months of a base limitation of liability. Super caps are sometimes 3 to 4x that. We've also seen a pretty big push, I'm going to say in the last 18 months, to ensure that super cap covers whatever your cybersecurity deductible is.
Yep.
And in some cases, that can exceed even 4x the base limitation liability. We've seen clients that have successfully negotiated hard dollar caps that in some cases exceed the total contract value of those services. Providers are reluctant to sign up for it, but we have seen a few deals that actually were executed that way. Could you give us some insight on what you're seeing?
Sure, we're seeing 3 to 4x on some of the super caps, even for just straight up breaches of services obligations that result in a data security breach. And we're seeing aggressive pushes for liability floors. So even if the dollar value of the deal doesn't get that high, the customer's asking for somewhere around 40 to 50, 60, 70 million dollars, depending on the nature of their business, their potential exposure to regulators and the risks that are inherent in the service.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That matches what we're seeing. Any last words of advice?
No, I think it's important for customers to remember that outsourcing security services and entering into these managed services contracts for security services is a heightened level of risk, and it's important to consider how a breach of a service obligation will impact the security of your data, even if it's data on your own systems that the vendor itself is not removing from your environment.
Thanks, Ben. Looking forward to our next session.
Thanks, Doug.